Welcome. I'm going to be talking about UnoCSS, Vite, and single directory components. And this is coming out of some work I've been doing over the last year and a half-ish across a couple of projects where we use a new stack based off these tools and just kind of sharing what we've learned and some of my experience. So shout out to our sponsors. To say all these out loud, or have you seen them enough yet? Much appreciation. Who am I? I am Andrew Morton. I've been a Drupal dev. Drupal.org says almost 14 years, but I started a year before that, I think, so almost 15 years. I just checked. I've got 126 patches that have been accepted. I'm one of the co-organizers of the local Seattle Drupal user group and the conference. I'm also an informatics alumni, which is fun for me because that was in this building. So I've spent 3 years of my college career walking around these halls day after day, and it's just kind of fun to like have these converging circles where just remember the good times in school. So the themes I'm going to be addressing as part of this are about code quality and maintenance. If you think about like maintaining your code or keeping it polished, sometimes it's difficult. Like when you're on a deadline, design consistency can suffer, especially if there's multiple developers on a team doing things in different ways. Learning some techniques to address that using components and utilities. I'm going to talk about some of the complexities of Drupal theming and an intro to some of the new current modern tooling. This is the project that kind of kicked this off for me. We started this about a year ago, at the end of last year, and it took quite a while. It finished early this year. It was a Drupal 7 to 10 upgrade. This is for the University of Texas, Austin. There's a art studio on campus. So this is showing their video art, and their other art pieces. It was a rebuild with an existing design. I actually think the design was pretty clean, pretty fresh. So we did approach it with this new stack. But it was an interesting choice because in hindsight, maybe we could have looked into upgrading the theme. It's always a difficult call because like you really want the new stuff, especially if you're going to be maintaining it for the next 5 or 10 years. But I can't say it's free. Like you definitely have to put some effort into it. However, the things that I learned on this have been rolling forward into future projects, and things have been accelerating. So here's just a couple screenshots. And call out like some of where we've got like component and style reuse. Some of the things that are generally difficult are keeping track of, like, you can see the amount of typography variation that's here. So in some cases, you want to be able to reuse one of these styles in a sane way, and in other places you want to have like a bunch more variations. We used some grids. This one is a pretty complex component. The way the responsive design collapses these containers. This slanted thing that Aaron figured out back there. This uses custom blocks and different display modes to configure how the block gets rendered in the grid. This is a view of cards. You probably see this kind of component in just about every site. Here's showing some of the reuse. This is a component that was on the home page that's now on the video art listing page. Here's an example of another fairly complex component with a lot of typography styles. This one is using For this, we used the Splide library for slideshows and created a field formatter so that we could show referenced media in a slider. So the challenges that I keep seeing recurring across projects are keeping the front-end code like well maintained and organized in a way where it's not just in one person's head, so that the next dev after them can make sense of the same structure and extend it logically without, adding like a overrides.css file at the end of, after, instead of compiling the code again. I think as a Drupal developer, I think we're kind of a little bit removed from some of the what's going on in the front end world and in JavaScript. So this was an opportunity for me to start reading up on that stuff and get a handle on what it is and what it isn't and what kind of tooling we want to have for ourselves. And also just kind of thinking about the nature of how do you do simple HTML and CSS without getting bogged down by Drupal? If you've got like a front-end wizard, like how do you let them excel at their stuff without running into things that trip them up and make them feel like they're not going fast enough? So some of the techniques that have come out to address some of these challenges, component-driven development is kind of one of the leading ones that's pretty hot right now. It's kind of a concept of having more modular encapsulated code that's easier to reuse. Because all the code is in the same place, instead of having like one file for all of your content that has like different styles in it for different pages or different content types or display modes, each thing is sort of stuck with the HTML that it's going to be rendered with. So it's just easier to look at that code and say, do I need this as part of this or not? No, I'll just delete it. Traditionally, we've got libraries, which are CSS files that define classes. And if you want to instantiate that component, you would sort of sprinkle those classes into like maybe a view or a node template or something. But more often than not, the actual HTML is coexisting with the CSS. So it makes sense to bundle them so that you can reuse that chunk rather than load a library and repeat the chunk. With SDC, and I think with a lot of the concept of components means that the dependencies are included automatically. Again, like you're not depending on global dependencies already existing for your component to work correctly. Props and slots are a common paradigm that we're seeing in web components and across all other like front-end frameworks. If you think about the component schema .yaml file, it's essentially defining a schema that allows these components to interoperate with other systems. So I think SDC kind of opens the door for other design systems like Storybook or Pattern Lab. There have been other efforts in Drupal in the past. I think this is just where things are consolidating and going into Experience Builder so that we can all kind of build on a common stack. And the concept of components kind of allow people to work in isolation away from the framework that they're kind of tied to, the Drupalisms. Another concept here is design tokens. These are essentially little snippets that you're going to want to reuse that sort of capture some base styles that are part of your underlying design. So one thing that's really common is using defining fonts or colors or specific spacings. Having these predefined up front will allow different developers to reuse them consistently and allows you to change them in one place. Utility classes are essentially what Tailwind gives you. Utility classes essentially, the concept of utility classes and design tokens are sort of blended together. Utility classes are like the functional part of it, like the actual classes. The design tokens are more the conceptual part of what you should be naming your classes and what your classes should do. When you're using Tailwind, you're going to want to tree shake the library so that it basically only includes the classes that you're using in your application. So that way it's really lean. The other aspect of utility classes is that in general, when you start your project, you're doing the bulk of your development and you're adding like the majority of the classes. But over time, you're adding classes that you've already used. So when you compile the output, it's growing at a slower and slower pace over time. One thing that's kind of counter to that is if you create your own utility classes, that sort of moves away from that super compactness and more into collections of stuff again. So I think in practice you have like a balance of both. Cube CSS is a methodology that I found that addresses these concepts. I recommend just checking it out. I don't follow it like religiously or anything, but I think the concepts of how it explains CSS make sense to me. So like the C stands for composability. So that's kind of the concept of being able to specify your utilities and your components and then build those up into larger and larger things. In the case of Drupal, that means being able to have layout sections and blocks that all work well together so you can configure things in the interface based on the utilities and styles you've provided, and it all just works without your client coming back and saying, I put the block in the layout and it broke the page. So some of that does take some testing and some pre-thought ahead of time to make sure that that stuff does fit together. Utilities are essentially the Tailwind utilities. Blocks, if you're familiar with BEM, this methodology basically says use that, but it's okay if you're a little loose about it. Exceptions, I honestly haven't really used this. My focus has been on basically utilities, the concept of composition, and the usage of block classes that look like BEM. But really, my favorite thing is about, like, don't go all in on utility classes. Use the cascade for what it is. Because that's how you can do some more elegant expression of CSS and have that impact a wide swath of things. So back to build tools. I think my first build tool I saw was Compass, which was Ruby based. And then after that, we replaced it with Grunt and then Gulp. Webpack's been around for a while. And now lately, there's been this explosion of new stuff where these tools, Vite, Bun, Parcel, they're written in Go, Rust, and other low-level compiled languages, versus these other ones are written in JavaScript or Ruby, and they're scripted, so they just don't operate as quickly. These two, Rollup and ESBuild, are some of they're like common tools that you'll find incorporated in some of the other build tools. ESBuild is, we're kind of getting into, like, there's a spectrum of like building your CSS with something like PostCSS versus compiling JavaScript applications, which is a whole different ballgame. So you can go as deep or as light as you want to. I suggest kind of iterating through it slowly so you're not just stuck trying to build a theme that you don't know how to compile. Another thing that came up while I was thinking about this is the way that Drupal handles third-party libraries. Lately, we've got Asset Packagist, which is a composer repository that lets us install Bower NPM packages. What's challenging about that, though, is that different modules might require different versions, and so you end up with a bunch of conflicts. The way that it's loaded, it's sort of like a kitchen sink, and if you use parts of that library, like, great, it's there, it'll work, but you've also loaded like 90% of the code that you don't need. So these new build tools that are really fast, they're really for when you have like a full application written in JavaScript, to make a change and see that change on the page, this is where you want that speed. So it is nice for day-to-day development, and it will scale to handle more complex. Like if you want to have a component that is written in Vue or written in React or something, you could use this to sideload everything into your site. So, this is what I mentioned. The old way, you might load jQuery in your head and then load your own code after that. And so there's sort of this mental paradigm where all the modules have to follow that same pattern, which means they have to use jQuery. In the new way, you would be bundling only what you need. Is anyone familiar with how that works in JavaScript? JavaScript modules? Okay, I do have another slide on this.
You mean like imports and that kind of thing?
Import, yeah. And NPM repository packages.
Gotcha, yeah.
So I'm not going to be talking about JS frameworks. That's beyond this. This is more about like libraries that you might want to use in Drupal. So like Alpine, JS, HTMX, things that would make PHP more interactive. So you don't need a framework or a JavaScript framework. So JavaScript started to really change with Node.js when they started to use the V8 Chrome engine browser runtime on the server, and people started coding JavaScript on the server. Over time, different standards have come out. So CommonJS is the module standard for Node.js, and so modules are written like this. ESM is from EMCA script. So this will be the new format going forward that we're all kind of standardizing around, where it's export default. The challenge right now is that there's a bunch of different packages that are all written differently, and as a seasoned developer coming into this for the first time, I was like, why can't I just load the package into my script and use it? Because reasons. But basically, you need to have a build tool, and it needs to be configured correctly, and that the nature of correct configuration for these build tools has gotten pretty difficult. So something else I think about often is Drupal versus JavaScript. Like, what do we have? What are we missing? I describe Drupal as already server-side rendering. We do have interactive components. You just build them with Ajax. Spend a lot of time like composing components, typing out the HTML and the CSS, and just thinking about like the nature of this. I'm feeling like Twig is a templating language. I like it. That versus React components, I don't think we're really missing anything. I was thinking about comparisons between a SDC's component.yaml versus TypeScript. They're essentially just ways of defining what parameters are allowed in your component, so that when other code uses it, it has some like feedback on whether or not they're using it correctly. And that allows large systems to scale without being brittle. I think about how Drupal's render pipeline, you start by loading some data like an entity, and then on its way to being rendered on the page, there's different events that you can hook into. They will either change the data or change the rendering. So I think about it as it's inside out. So it's sort of like bubbling up until it hits the surface, and then whatever version is at the surface is what you're going to see. In JavaScript frameworks, and sort of in more of a component-driven paradigm, it's more outside in, where you're like, this is what it's going to look like, and that's the data I need. So give me that, and I'll render it over here. I think some other projects that are interesting to look at that sort of start to bridge the the stability and the maturity that we have in our PHP frameworks with the newfangled cool interactive stuff that we can do with JavaScript frameworks. I think HTMX is a cool project. That one's been gaining popularity. Inertia.js is something I've heard about recently. This one basically lets you do some more like server rendered components that are coupled with your backend just all through PHP. Like if JavaScript can transpile to JavaScript, why can't PHP? So that's why we were looking into a new stack and some new techniques. This is where we arrived. We're using UnoCSS, which is it's basically Tailwind classes. Like I use the Tailwind documentation to look up what classes I need. But there's also it's also extensible. So there's plugins, there's deeper configuration. I really enjoyed using the fonts and icons and shortcut classes. So having a consistent way to get fonts loaded in your site just answered one of our big questions that comes up on every project. So now on a project that uses this stack, we know to just look in the Uno config file. Yeah.
Sorry, is it literally Tailwind with more options? Like literally it's the same engine at the core?
Not, and well, I don't, no, it's a different tech.
But by that I mean like I saw you had like P-4, right? Are you saying like at the utility class level, the markup is the same?
Yeah, it's literally Tailwind classes.
Literally the same. Okay, that's awesome.
Nothing new to learn.
Yeah, they did.
Yeah, it's just different ways to configure it, different ways to specify the available tokens. But yeah, no, I literally use the Tailwind documentation.
Wow, cool.
Vite is one of the new generation of build tools. Vite is a little different. I think a lot of the other build tools are often tied to a framework. Vite comes from the Vue world, but it is a little more agnostic. Out of the box, it's sort of like a single app runtime or a single page app runtime, where if you create a local Vite project, it will give you an index.html file that's loading a CSS file and a JavaScript file, and you can just start playing in there. If you do npm run dev, it spins up a Vite dev server, and it would just do the live updates in your browser, and you can see the stuff on the fly. So single directory components is it's been around a while in Drupal, but it's gone into core in 10.3, and it's on one level it's not radically different. It's still like Twig, it's still libraries. It just encapsulates it in a more convenient way that allows you to do component-driven development without the effort. So it's not. One of the benefits is loading the libraries from the directory automatically, so you don't have to create a directory, put your libraries in it, go back to your libraries.yaml file to find the libraries to load. It's all self-contained. And so yeah, there's provisions in Drupal to reuse single directory components. So here's some examples with UnoCSS. In the uno.config.js file, you can define things like your theme settings, like your colors, and then you get the Tailwind classes for those colors. I think that part's kind of similar. And there's other things you put here, like breakpoints, spacing, that type of stuff. I think this is where it gets into unique UnoCSS stuff. So with shortcuts, you're defining, they're basically utility classes, so collections of other classes. This is not a representative demo or example. In this case, this bleed gave us a component that would just go edge to edge. This syntax here, where you put custom styles in the brackets, I believe that does exist with Tailwind itself as well. This is something I kind of wondered about, whether when you end up with custom properties in the utility itself, I start to wonder, like, why not just CSS? But here's an example of how compact things can get. You might, when you first start off using Tailwind, you might inject a whole bunch of classes into your button element, and then you kind of lose the readability of utility classes. But if you want all your buttons to just look like this, you can make a shortcut, and then that's your utility class, is just .button. You could also make variations of shortcuts in here.
Can you use CSS variables within those defined classes?
We do have some where the colors are defined with variables. Yeah, so when the CSS builds, instead of putting the color token in there, it puts the variable call in there. So it will render on the fly. Yeah, that's a good point. So you can make this really complicated or more flexible by putting variables into those, and then you could define the variables in your CSS just before you load a component. Another big win for UnoCSS was the ability to define fonts. So this is a plugin, but it's a plugin that's included preset web fonts. By default, it's going to load from Google Fonts. So the config for setting that up is really easy. You give it a name for what, just basically what you want to refer to that font as internally. The name of the font, different weights you want to load. Some fonts might have different settings if they're like a variable font. But that gives you these token classes, font header, font body. So, that made it really easy to use these in different places. There is also a font loader setting with this, so you could download Google Fonts and serve them locally, which is a good way to go if you want to avoid having Google get pinged every time someone comes to your website. This is where UnoCSS starts to show its more advanced side. So the screenshot's from my browser console. You can see Vite is running in here. UnoCSS DevTools is enabled. And basically, if I make a change, it detects that change and will update that file. Yeah, so Vite's a good tool. I talked about this already. But Vite does have post-CSS inside of it, so you can use Tailwind classes in CSS, which I like to do because it gives you the design token aspect of it. Whereas one of the big problems I was finding with handwritten CSS is devs have their own conventions. Like, I like to use 1 rem or half rem or quarter rem. Some people like to use pixels, and like it just gets out of sync. But if you use the Tailwind classes in CSS using the apply statement, then you get the best of both worlds. The other thing is that when you change CSS, that refreshes instantly. When you change a twig template, the whole page has to refresh. There is a way around this. There's a Vite plugin for Drupal twig. I just didn't have time to figure it out before this talk. That'll be a next step. So under the hood, the way it works is through a manifest.json file. When you build the code, it looks at all the paths and it compiles all that code into the dist directory. And then it also generates this manifest.json file that maps the path in the dist directory to the original path so that when a file is requested, it knows where to grab it. This might also contain information about bundling. So if one thing that's really cool about bundling, like I have one example in here that's a slideshow library that's used in different places. So it's able to grab the code that it needs, stick that into a file, and then the two components that reference that library reference this like compact minified version that's like hyper optimized. So it's doing things in a much more efficient way than we've had before. So the integration between Vite and Drupal uses this Vite module. This is where I had to spend some time patching things to keep up with the changes in Drupal. Because during the time of this project, when I started, SDC was experimental in core, or it wasn't in core. It was a contrib module, and by the end, it was incorporated in core. And throughout, this Vite module had to keep getting updated when SDC went into core, there were changes in it. The way that it defined the libraries in the directory, the naming of that had changed. So it was kind of rough. We had to quickly dig in and patch things to get it working again. Even now, the last patch in the Vite module does have some breaking things. Someone changed, they added a slash to the start of some paths, and you need a patch that undoes that to get it working again. It might be because they're using a different, not Uno or something, or maybe some other front-end tool that's building it differently, but we're still hashing out how to handle that both. Okay, so I'm going to quickly breeze through how to set up a theme with this. So, is everyone using Starter Kit theme? Anyone? 2, 3? Okay. So yeah, Starter Kit is fairly new with Drupal. There's this weird script in this directory that you can call to create a new Starter Kit theme. The previous version of Starter Kit is essentially doing a theme that's based off of stable or based off of classy. With stable, it's essentially a copy of all these core themes so that it is stable over time, it doesn't change. With classy, it's basically that plus useful classes on your templates. The difference is that with this, you sort of get a snapshot of the templates, and then from there, you're expected to just customize those on your own. When everything is based on stable, it's kind of like they can't update it because that would break other things. So this paradigm of copy the current version and customize from there just seems to be a healthier way to manage this kind of code. So I'm going to talk through what you get out of the box. So after you run this, you get a theme. That theme has default templates in it, some default CSS, and here's some thoughts on cleaning that up. So the template's just a good starting point, I think. That's why I went with Starter Kit instead of just a brand new base theme. It gives you this CSS directory with a bunch of component CSS in it. So in that directory, there are a mix of global styles and individual components that you want to load individually. So I recommend splitting those up because otherwise you just get confused. When you look, sometimes you want to look for a specific file, but you see them all jumbled together. I have another slide that shows how to split that up. Yeah, I could go into more detail on that later if we have time. So again, out of the box, when you generate starter theme, starter kit, you get these libraries loaded by default globally. A base library, messages, and the core normalize. You get these extensions in the info file, where user/Drupal.user is a core library that's loaded on the user's page, and by default, you're given Vite starter/user, which is a library that's set up to extend that core library. So it's kind of a convenience thing, but I'm calling these things out because this is a typical starting point for Drupal theming. This is the stuff you need to be aware of, because as much as I'm saying components helps you escape from the Drupalisms, not entirely. You still have to be aware of them, and you have to work with them if you really want a polished output. Some more things to be aware of. I suggest going and checking out these files. System.libraries.yaml is where there's a lot of admin styles. System base is a library that's in there that's got a whole bunch of base stuff that might trip you up. Like if you're doing your HTML and CSS and you think you have a clean slate, all of a sudden you have a little component that's doing something different, and you're like, where did that come from? I didn't make you. Core.libraries.yaml is where there's a lot of Drupal core included libraries like jQuery or Drupal dialog. I would say that I've stumbled into these things more because I tried to make a admin theme. If you're making a front-end theme and you just never turn it on for admin pages, you won't encounter a lot of stuff like this. I kind of did it out of curiosity and kind of just to have some base components to start styling that were really complicated out of the box. I wanted to have a flexible set of form styles that worked with any form, that didn't take additional headaches each time you had to style a form. There are a few form utilities inside of here, there's container inline in core. Just things that you'd want to know when you're writing your components that you'd end up duplicating utilities otherwise. Oh, and I guess one other point on that, some of these utilities conflict with the Tailwind stuff. So how about the block class? Is it a Drupal block? Is it a CSS block? So in some cases I had to disable some of the Tailwind stuff so it didn't conflict or change the default class name. Okay, so here's my recommended library layout. So that CSS directory that I started with, I split into library/global, and half of those CSS files are component CSS that I just stick in this directory. The other half are individual components, so those all just live in this directory. And in my global directory, I have these split out according to Drupal's max layers. And basically, I name it global just so I know everything in here is going to be loaded on every page. So make sure that's what you want when you add code in here. Otherwise, I suggest creating a component, or in some cases, maybe a library component so that you can have some more shared stuff. So again, these are loaded via the theme.info file. And these are just loaded as needed with attached library. And if you for attached library in the default templates, you'll see, it'll make sense how everything is wired together. The defined default libraries and where exactly they're getting shown. So here's the install instructions. You can just follow us along. Here's how you configure Drupal with the Vite module. First, you're going to want to set up your local environment so that where you're running your dev server can connect to where you're running your site. Your settings in settings.php. You have to tell it to generate the manifest.json. Include UnoCSS and configure output paths. This was the thing that took a really long time to figure out. On the left was all pretty straightforward. We want source maps, replace the directory, and manifest true is the big one that generates the manifest file. But on the right, this was very tricky to figure out. So Rollup is one of the fast bundlers. Vite is sort of a plugin system that wraps it to make it more configurable and flexible. But this is the thing that does the important part, that looks at these files, and compiles the final output. So any JavaScript or CSS in my components, looking through layouts. Actually, this is an old line. That should be the libraries directory. No, sorry, not libraries. There's a little config thing just to specify what the output file names are. I'll share this with these slides, and if anyone has any challenges, I can help you out. This is about all the tricky things about Drupal theming. So even if you've escaped and you're writing a component, if you want to override one of these things, you're going to have to figure out how. And it's not just about like the tricky nature of overriding it. Sometimes it's about instantiating a component in a way that it is reusable in Drupal. So the easiest is template overrides. If you look at the template suggestions, it tells you what to name your template. It'll just take over the output. You can start coding it. Libraries are kind of tricky for people, like knowing how exactly to get your HTML or your CSS or JavaScript loaded on the page. Layout Builder is a big part of the story these days. SDC, you got to learn some hooks. Defining a new theme hook is pretty tricky. Same with pre-processing existing stuff. Even finding like the right thing to override, especially if the thing already is a using a suggested template pattern. Render elements are the class inside of Drupal that it's just the confusion between hook theme and render elements for new Drupal devs. These are plugins, field formatters, and views display plugin. These are fairly easy to write, and you can generate them with Drush. So if you do drush gen field formatter, it'll give you a file, and you just put in your logic in the render function. So I feel like some of these are worth getting a little practice, getting comfortable at, because once you know how to do it, it's super easy and flexible. So I mentioned the challenges of theming admin pages and the core libraries that can help you or trip you up. Back to SDC. SDC is nice because all the code is in one place, it's encapsulated, libraries are included, you do integration with the design systems. I highly recommend reading the docs because it explains the concepts and how to use it with more examples than what I have here. But to recap briefly, there's a quick way to include a component entirely. Using this syntax, you can include it with by passing properties. Using this syntax, you can basically, this is how you would use slots. So in the component itself, you would define slots as blocks, and then in the YAML file, you would define the available slots. And then when you're using the component, you can override, exactly how that block is being rendered and how you're passing data in. So let's look at a card example. So these are two different views that are displaying cards. The cards are mostly the same. The image dimension is slightly different, and this one has some white italic text, or white background italic text at the bottom. So thinking kind of generally about a component, there's a title, the whole thing has a link or a URL, there's an image, this one has an artist name here. If you think about cards in a system, you might have all kinds of different variations. Maybe some are oriented differently, or different sizes or shapes, different colors or something. So you need a system that allows you to make those variations and handle them sanely. Here is what a card component might look like using some Tailwind classes. So this would be like a display template for the artwork node type, or a display mode template called the display mode called card. So if you were just kind of doing the template override using Tailwind, you'd fill stuff out kind of similar to this. You'd see there's kind of a big chunk of classes here. Maybe the first line, absolute bottom 0, width full kind of makes sense, but then it's just a lot more stuff following that, kind of blends together. So thinking about how to turn this into a component, kind of recognizing that the main parts of this, we've got relative on the wrapper, and this part that's over the image needs to have absolute, and the bottom 0 positions it. So following some of the concepts with Cube, you can abstract those into utility classes, and that keeps your template a lot cleaner. And so if you want to have a instance of this where you have a custom version, sorry, I keep doing that, you can wrap your variable with Tailwind classes. So ultimately you get like a mix between card and card body plus Tailwind, and that ends up like compressing the number of classes that are there. Here's a more practical use case, and don't look too closely because it actually doesn't really line up. But as an example, you can define props and slots in your component.yaml file. This, if you kind of squint at it, is an example of where you've got slots in a component that have custom overrides, basically. So yeah, you can make variations in this way. And it's about as minimal as it can get, where it gives you the right amount of flexibility and the right amount of consistency across these card components. So thinking about composition, if you've defined a component, you want to be able to reuse that component in different places. This example was a view. So if you think about just in an abstract sense, if you already have a card in a library file, you could edit your view's rows and put in classes. So like each row is a card, and then this field has this wrapper, and that wrapper is defined in this card library, and everything looks good on the page. That's a concept of writing your CSS in a way that it is flexible and composable. Alternatively, you could define a card component and make sure, and then make a card display mode and configure that display mode to use your card component, and then in your view, just select that display mode. If you do it that way, then when you change the card component, it will update there and everywhere else that you're using it. Versus if you've sprinkled card classes into your view, you might have to go back to your view and adjust some classes. Alternatively, you can make a views display plugin. That way you can define what options you want for your component or for the grid part of your component. It's easier to reuse because you can select that component for other views. You might want to display these kinds of cards in an entity reference field as a field formatter, or creating different display modes is a common pattern I'm using if I need to use like a chunk of an entity and have that as a reusable thing. So getting into some of the modules that let us reuse SDC in a flexible way. SDC block converts your components into blocks. So this interface on the right here, I went to the block structure interface, clicked add block, clicked on add one of the SDC blocks that I have defined called promo newsletter, and it takes the props from your component.yaml file and gives you a form based off those props. So if I wanted a custom block, I'd have to generate the block plugin, I'd have to define the form, I'd have to define what happens when you save the form, I'd have to maybe do a hook theme to define a theme hook, or create my own render array in the build function. But with this, it just goes from component file, .yaml file to component.twig. And so this will work in the block layout as well as layout builder. That's been really, yeah.
So would you say that the majority of the time when you're writing SDC, that you are exposing is the right word, using them via a field formatter or a block? That's where I struggle a lot. Like I can create a component, but how should I get to that component when I want to use it?
Yeah, I'm pretty flexible. I do it that way, and then also inside of other templates. So I have a lot of templates that just verbatim call components, or even pass in like
that feels like less reusable to me when if I override some, I don't know, node template or something and call a component from there, then I'm only able to reach that component through a custom template as opposed to through Drupal's UI. So I'm always trying to figure out. That feels dirty to me, like to do it directly on the template.
Yeah.
It's not like in the spirit of the component where it's super reusable. So I'm just trying to figure out if, like, blocks and formatters are the two places that I've always thought of, but are there more places that I should be thinking about? Maybe that's my real question.
Yeah, you're thinking along the right lines, or the right lines where you're right, because it does feel dirty to do that in a template, because for all the reasons you just said. So field formatters, view display formatters,
Okay.
that covers a ton of it. Maybe a CK editor plugin. Wherever you can write a plugin and you want to display a component, that's a good place to do it. But I think the future is around Experience Builder giving you the interface to do all these things.
Right. All right, thank you.
Yep. Yep.
Go ahead. Sorry, a quick question. With the more complex, like object or things like that, what does SDC block do? Does it just like fuck off? I don't care, or do you?
That's a good question. So,
like, because there's like array object. There's some of those like more complicated ones. Does it just give up at that point, or?
that's a good question. Yeah, I think if I use, so the component.yaml uses JSON schema, and that's not aware of Drupal classes, although you can define a class. So you can specify attributes, for example, the attributes twig object. If you wanted to define like a entity reference, I think it would be done as a integer, and then this might be a limitation.
Oh, very interesting. So you set it to integer, and it would be like, okay, I could play around with that.
But that's not ideal. I think.
Correct, because you wouldn't get the interface by default in the field format.
Right. Yeah, that's something to look into.
Andrew, may I ask a question?
Yeah.
So SDC block, if I understand it, for every single directory component that you have, it's going to create a block type.
Oh, not a content block.
No.
So a block plugin.
Right. So when you go to add block, it would show up in your block. Like let's say you have a card SDC. You go to add block, and it would be card block. Is that what it's doing?
Yes, but in the block structure, not the block library.
Okay. Is there any modules, and maybe you were going to get to this, but so stop me, but are there any modules, and this is going off your question back there, that will take an entity or can understand an entity type and map it to an SDC? Like, I feel like there's a missing point here. It's like, there you go.
Okay, yeah, SDC display is what you're thinking about.
Got it.
Where, so this screenshot here is in the manage display interface for a content type. And you can choose a component. So this screenshot shows the default component screenshot. If you want to, you can take screenshots of your components, put them in your single directories, and then they'd be loaded here. So yeah, you choose a component, and then same thing. There's two different ways this works. On one hand, there's these fixed values. You can use a token. On the other, you can map your fields to these props and slots. Something to think about, when you do it this way, it's grabbing the value off of the entity. When you do it this way, it's using the configured formatter for the field. So be really careful about that. And that kind of feeds into what you're thinking about. Like, in some cases, you wouldn't want, like, a prop with a form. You might want a slot that you could put a reference thing into. And then in that case, I'd be putting a, like, artist here as an entity reference that's, in this case, going into a prop, but could be a slot. How am I on time?
How about,
You can go all evening. This is the last
but you're the last one, so.
until they kick us out.
I'm not hearing any music, so I'm going to keep going. So this is where things got pretty interesting, incorporating an NPM library. We looked into a few different slideshow libraries because the ones that are available as Drupal modules, Splide, and there are a couple others. I don't know if anyone has experience with those, but I've been really frustrated lately with Splide especially. Splide is a really flexible library for making slideshows, but the way it works in Drupal is it gives you a Drupal form with like 50 options, and it's really confusing, like, what does this option do? And so it just made way more sense to me to go read the API and configure the library according to the documentation. And like, it just didn't make sense to me to learn this complex interface that was just clunky and frustrating. And they had all these like default styles that got in my way. So anyway, with this, I'm using Vite to bundle it. So I'm importing Swiper from the node package. I'm importing exactly the parts of it that I need, importing the CSS for it. And then in here, you're just calling Swiper. I would define my collection of config in here, which is significantly more minimal than the form. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, this is my big question set, was writing like nice JavaScript into SDC that's going to compile into compressed JavaScript, and how you guys are kind of managing that, because we ran into this with our own SDC. So I ended up calling them very temporarily. It's hideous, but wildcard.dev.js that compiles into wildcard.js in the same SDC folder, so you could write fancy import ready JS. But what was your solution for writing nice JS into the SDC folder?
Vite just handles it. So by putting these up here, so this will actually compile into the dist directory, but then it doesn't really matter. Like, you could compile into the current directory if you wanted to. What's happening when I import Swiper here in this component, and if I also import it in another component,
Yeah.
you can see down here it's created this bundle. So this isn't a complete list, but if I had two different slider components, they would both be referencing and sharing that bundle. Does that answer the question?
Sort of, but then so okay, you have this JS file, let's say, in your slider SDC component.
Correct. Yeah.
Right. It's not being replaced in that SDC component, so you're kind of losing Drupal's cool feature of you call an SDC twig file, you include it in a node teaser, say, right, and right away you're getting the JS and the CSS right there. This is putting it into the dist folder, where is that living? And
Well, okay, so that happens with the Vite module. So the source directory, the source of the JavaScript is in the directory with your twig. When it's bundled, the output is in your dist file somewhere else, but that doesn't matter. When Drupal does the library determining, like the library registry, I think, the theme registry with all the library paths, that's when the Vite module overwrites the libraries that are Vite enabled and says, if you're looking for the file that's in the component directory, check out the manifest.json file to find out where it really is.
Very interesting. Okay. That's the missing piece. That's the missing piece because I'm writing and it's converting. Yeah, okay, that's the missing piece.
Yes, yeah, it's huge and it's tricky, and yeah. Well, it sounds like people want to go.
Sorry.
Sure. Any questions? I'll just kind of breeze through the rest here. Here's a views plugin. This is really key. I scaffolded this file with Drush, and then in this render function, I just call a component after massaging some variables. You could do that for views as well, or for field plugins. This is the output and stuff to discuss. And I'm done.